les jours, ce sont les jours de la femme. Et
This partnership with India is not just about seeds or machines, it is about sovereignty. Burkina Faso will no longer beg for food. With this billion-dollar investment, we will secure our harvests, feed our people, and strengthen Africa's independence. No foreign power will dictate our destiny. Our soil, our future, our pride belong to us.
Imagine standing in the middle of a dusty field where cracked soil stretches for miles, and children watch their parents dig into ground that hasn't given a decent harvest in years. Suddenly, the country's young leader, Ibrahim, announces something shocking: a billion-dollar partnership with India. Not a charity deal, not just another round of promises, but a gamble so massive it could either end Africa's food crisis or make his nation even more dependent on outside powers. And here's the twist: this wasn't just about food. Hidden inside the deal was a push for Indian agri-tech dominance in Africa: high-yield seeds, AI-driven irrigation, and mega-scale farming projects that could reshape the entire continent. But why would a leader barely in his 30s risk everything on one massive bet with India? And what's India really after in the heart of Africa? To answer that, we've got to rewind, because this deal didn't come out of nowhere. Burkina Faso has long been a land where farmers depend on rain like gamblers waiting for luck. For decades, droughts turned promising harvests into dust, while floods wiped out fragile crops overnight. Nearly 80% of the population relies on agriculture to survive, yet the country imports billions worth of food every year. This wasn't just bad economics, it was survival on the line. Food shortages meant spiraling prices. Families would spend half their income on a single bag of rice. Children were pulled out of school to work the fields. And when rains failed, entire communities starved. Who took power in 2022 at just 34 years old? This wasn't a problem to push off until later. If he didn't solve food security, his government could collapse before it even got started. That urgency set the stage for the boldest move of his short political career. But here's the part most people don't know. Africa's food crisis isn't about land. Africa has some of the most fertile soil on Earth. The real bottleneck is technology: modern seeds, irrigation systems, storage facilities, and digital tools that can forecast harvests. And this is exactly where India saw its opening. So how did India go from being a country that once battled famines itself to now presenting itself as the continent's great agricultural savior? That story is where things get really interesting. Not too long ago, India was battling its own nightmare of hunger. In the 1960s, millions faced shortages so severe that the country relied heavily on foreign aid just to feed its people. But then came the so-called Green Revolution, a mix of high-yield seeds, chemical fertilizers, and irrigation systems that transformed India from a food deficit nation into the world's largest rice exporter. That transformation wasn't smooth. The soil was strained, groundwater levels sank, and farmers often went into debt. Yet despite those flaws, India developed something priceless: an agricultural toolkit that could be exported. By the 2000s, Indian scientists weren't just feeding India, they were designing low-cost technologies like drip irrigation systems, pest-resistant crops, and mobile apps that let farmers track weather patterns in real time. This is exactly what caught EA's attention. Unlike Western agribusiness giants, India didn't pitch itself as a corporate overlord. Instead, it came as a partner from the global south, a country that had once walked the same path of famine and scarcity and claimed to know the way out. Still, behind the friendly handshake was something more strategic. India wasn't simply offering seeds and tractors. It was positioning itself to control Africa's agricultural future, from seed patents to irrigation data to food trade routes. And that's the part that makes this deal so much more than just a farming upgrade. Because once you control food, you control people. And once you control food supply chains, you control entire nations. But to see how got pulled into this billion-dollar gamble, we need to look at the backroom negotiations and the almost unbelievable promises India made to Burkina Faso. In late-night meetings far from the cameras, Indian delegations rolled out a menu of promises that sounded almost too good to be true: a network of smart farms across Burkina Faso, fitted with AI soil sensors and satellite-linked irrigation, massive grain storage silos to stop post-harvest losses that often swallowed up to 30% of Burkina's crops, even a plan to introduce bio-fortified staple foods to fight malnutrition. The figure on the table, $1 billion, a mix of loans, tech transfers, and direct investment. India's pitch was clear: Burkina Faso would become the testing ground for a model that could later be expanded across the continent. This was a lifeline. International institutions like the IMF and World Bank were tightening conditions. Western investors were cautious. But India? India came with money, machines, and the political narrative of South-South cooperation. Of course, there were strings attached. The seeds would largely come from Indian firms. The software platforms would be Indian-made. The irrigation systems, tractors, and processing machines all Indian exports. Burkina would gain food security, but India would gain a strategic foothold. Still, took the leap, and almost immediately, the deal set off alarm bells in unexpected places. Because Africa's food future isn't just about food, it's a battlefield where global powers quietly fight for dominance. And one of those powers, watching India's bold move into Burkina Faso, was China. China has been pouring billions into African infrastructure, ports, railways, mines. But one area it has increasingly eyed is food. With 1.4 billion people to feed, China sees Africa's fertile land as insurance against its own future shortages. So when India announced its Agri-Tech mega deal with Burkina Faso, Chinese analysts immediately saw it as a challenge. If India could prove it could feed Africa, it would win not just markets, but loyalty. Food security would become foreign policy. Western countries, too, began to pay attention. For decades, American and European companies had been the ones selling seeds, fertilizers, and machinery to Africa. Now, here was India swooping in with lower costs and a political message that sounded less like neocolonialism and more like solidarity. And yet, while these global powers sized each other up on the ground in Burkina Faso, farmers were asking a simpler question: would this actually work? Because technology might sound impressive on paper, but Africa's soil, climate, and local traditions are different. And this is where the real test of the deal began: when the first seeds were planted. When the first round of Indian-backed farms launched, results were dramatic. Yields doubled in some pilot areas. Irrigation systems kept fields green even through dry spells. Storage facilities stopped food from rotting before it reached markets. For many families, this was the first time they had seen enough surplus to actually sell at decent prices. It looked like gamble was paying off. But beneath the success were cracks. Farmers who adopted Indian seeds soon discovered they couldn't easily replant them. The patents meant they had to keep buying every season. Traditional seed varieties, adapted to local conditions for centuries, began to vanish. The irrigation systems, while efficient, required maintenance contracts with Indian firms, and the digital apps collecting soil and weather data. They weren't just helping farmers, they were also flowing back to Indian companies, building a map of Africa's agricultural potential. In other words, the dream of food independence risked turning into new dependencies. Burkina Faso might produce more food, but who would truly own the system that made it possible? And that question would become even sharper when realized this deal wasn't just about Burkina Faso, it was about Africa's entire future. The Burkina Faso-India partnership quickly became a showcase. Delegations from Ghana, Mali, and Niger came to study the model. African Union officials praised the idea of South-South agricultural cooperation, and Indian firms, seeing new markets opening, began laying the groundwork for expansion. Too many in Africa, this was a chance to break free from the old dependency on the West. Why keep importing wheat from Europe when Africa could grow its own with modern technology? Why let American agribusiness dominate when an ally like India could offer cheaper solutions? But skeptics warned that replacing Western dependency with Indian dependency wasn't true independence. Food security isn't just about yields, it's about sovereignty. Who controls the seeds, the water, the storage, the data? In many ways, the Burkina deal was a mirror. It showed Africa both its potential and its risks. The gamble continues. Success could mean inspiring a continental shift, Africa feeding itself with help from a fellow global South power. Failure could mean locking his nation into yet another cycle of outside control. And so the question remains: is this the start of Africa's agricultural revolution, or just the latest chapter in a long story of promises and dependencies? At its heart, EU's billion-dollar deal with India is more than an economic agreement. It is a bet on whether Africa can leapfrog centuries of underdevelopment using technology from a country that once shared its struggles. The cracked soil of Burkina Faso may yet bloom into green fields of self-sufficiency, or it may reveal that no matter who the partner is West, East, or Global South, the true cost of food security is always tied to power, and that is the paradox of S. gamble. To gain independence, he may have to rely on someone else. Whether history judges this as bold leadership or reckless risk-taking will depend on one thing: the harvests yet to come.
On a blistering afternoon outside Ouagadougou, a farmer named Mariam bends over her sorghum field. For years, her harvest barely fed her 5 children. But this season, something is different. She's working with hybrid seeds provided under the India-Burkina deal. The plants grew faster, she says, shading her eyes. We harvested earlier, but the seeds are expensive. I cannot keep them for next year. Across the country, stories like Miriam's echo in villages. Some farmers celebrate the sudden jump in yields. Others worrying about losing control over what they plant. For generations, seeds were shared freely across communities, grandmothers passing down varieties that had adapted to local soil and climate. Now, the new rules of the game demand contracts, purchases, and dependence on an outside supplier. It's not just seeds. Young farmers like Odoma, who manages one of the pilot smart farms, describe how the irrigation sensors save water and boost output. But when a device malfunctions, there's no local technician who can repair it. We have to call India, Odoma shrugs, and wait weeks for parts. These small details might seem technical, but on the ground, they mean the difference between empowerment and dependency. They reveal the hidden price tag of agricultural modernization, the cost of not just adopting technology, but surrendering control. Food isn't just about survival, it's about politics. In Burkina Faso, where coups and instability have shaped modern history, controlling food supply is directly tied to controlling power. Traore knows this well. Analysts whisper that the billion-dollar deal was not only about boosting crops, but about securing loyalty. If farmers see visible improvements, if markets are full and bread prices stable, public support for his leadership grows stronger. In a country plagued by insurgency and hardship, food becomes a weapon of legitimacy. But here lies the paradox. By tying his political survival to Indian technology, Traore risks being at the mercy of forces beyond his borders. If Indian companies pull out, if global trade shifts, or if relations sour, Burkina Faso could be left stranded. And the bigger question is continental. African leaders have long spoken of food sovereignty in Africa that feeds itself on its own terms. Yet time and again, external powers swoop in with solutions that come wrapped in strings. The India deal, no matter how promising, forces Africa to ask itself, can true sovereignty be built on borrowed tools? To fully grasp the stakes, we need to look closer at India's motivations. This wasn't just an agricultural investment. For New Delhi, the Burkina Faso deal was part of a larger geopolitical play, a chance to counterbalance China's deepening hold on Africa, secure food trade routes, and win allies in international forums like the UN. India has a population of 1.4 billion to feed. While it is a major exporter today, climate change threatens its own crops. Diversifying agricultural influence abroad, especially in Africa's fertile regions, is like buying insurance for the future. Behind closed doors, Indian corporations see Africa as both a market and a laboratory. Low-cost Agri-Tech solutions tested in Burkina Faso could later be sold across West Africa. And if India controls not just the supply of food, but also the data on soil, water, and yields, it gains a long-term strategic advantage, one that goes far beyond farming. This isn't conspiracy, it's classic statcraft. Food security is power, and power is never given away for free. It didn't take long for Beijing to respond. Within months of the India-Burkina deal, Chinese companies began expanding their own agricultural footprints in neighboring Mali and Niger. Massive rice plantations, irrigation projects, and offers of debt-free equipment leases, all part of China's counter-strategy. Chinese diplomats quietly framed India's deal as neo-dependency under a new mask. Their pitch: China would provide infrastructure, not just seeds, roads, rail, and power grids that tied farms directly to markets. For African leaders, this rivalry looked like opportunity. Competing powers meant better bargaining positions, but for ordinary farmers, it risked turning their soil into a geopolitical chessboard where decisions in New Delhi or Beijing could determine whether their families eat. The fight for Africa's fields had officially begun. Meanwhile, Europe and the United States could not ignore the shift. For decades, Western agribusiness giants Monsanto, Bayer, Coggle dominated Africa's seed and fertilizer markets. India's entry was an unwelcome disruption. Reports soon surfaced of Western lobbying groups warning African governments about seed sovereignty risks under the India deal. NGOs raised alarms about patent dependency and soil degradation. The irony was not lost on African leaders. The very powers that had long controlled Africa's food systems were now warning against dependency. Still, Western firms began slashing prices, offering partnership packages, and in some cases, spreading quiet disinformation about Indian technology's failures. The narrative war around African food had begun to rival the battle for the soil itself. Caught between these global giants are the people who matter most, the farmers. In some villages, hybrid Indian crops outperformed expectations, fueling optimism. In others, farmers complained about debt from purchasing seeds and fertilizers. The generational divide became clear. Older farmers preferred traditional varieties, while younger ones, attracted by technology and higher yields, embraced the change. Women, who form the backbone of African farming, faced unique challenges. Some praised labor-saving machines that reduced hours spent bending over fields. Others worried that new technology contracts ignored women farmers, funneling credit and resources mostly to men. In focus groups conducted by NGOs, farmers expressed a recurring fear that once traditional knowledge disappears, there may be no going back. If these seeds fail, one farmer said, "What will we eat?" No matter how advanced the deal, one force looms above all others: climate change. Rains in the Sahel have grown unpredictable. Temperatures are rising faster than the global average. Desertification is swallowing farmland. In this context, technology may not just be helpful, it may be essential for survival. Indian Agri-Tech promises resilience, drought-resistant crops, smart irrigation, and data-driven planting calendars are designed for exactly these challenges. But the question remains, whose resilience is being built, Burkina Faso's or India's? Because when climate shocks hit, those who control the seeds, water, and data will decide not just who thrives, but who survives. To truly appreciate the weight of this gamble, it helps to see it in history's mirror. In the 1960s, India itself made a fateful bet during its Green Revolution. It worked at least in preventing famine, but it left scars of dependency on fertilizers, pesticides, and groundwater that persist to this day. Now, Traore faces a similar moment. His young leadership mirrors the urgency of India's past, but Africa's stakes are even higher. For a continent projected to host a quarter of the world's population by 2050, failure isn't just an economic setback, it's a humanitarian catastrophe. If this works, Burkina Faso could inspire a continental revolution. If it fails, it could lock Africa into a cycle of dependency that repeats the mistakes of the past. As the sun sets over the Burkina plains, the story remains unfinished. Fields of new hybrid crops wave in the evening breeze, but questions linger like shadows. Will Africa's soil bloom into a story of independence, with technology as a tool rather than a chain? Or will this billion-dollar deal become another entry in the long list of promises that enriched outsiders while leaving farmers in poverty? The truth is, no single season will decide. The test of this gamble is measured in decades, in generations, in the quiet moments when a farmer counts her harvest and decides whether she can plant again. For Ibrahim Traore, the gamble is personal. His leadership, his legitimacy, and perhaps his legacy hang on the outcome of seeds sown in fragile soil. For India, it is strategic, a chance to turn food into power. For Africa, it is existential, about nothing less than the right to feed itself. At its core, this story isn't about Burkina Faso or India alone. It's about the future of Africa and the global battle over food. Because food is not just nourishment. It is leverage, it is stability, it is survival. Whoever controls food controls the future. Traoré's billion-dollar gamble with India may one day be remembered as the spark that ignited Africa's agricultural revolution or as the deal that quietly reshaped sovereignty under a new dependency. The cracked fields of Burkina Faso now hold more than seeds. They hold a question that will shape the continent's destiny. Can Africa feed itself on its own terms, or will its soil forever be someone else's battlefield? And until that question is answered, every harvest is not just food on the table, it is history in the making.